Before we move on to other topics, I wanted to show you what an amazing tool common table expressions are to create complex data workflows. Because common table expressions are not just a trick to execute certain SQL queries, they're actually a tool that allows us to build data pipelines within our SQL code and that can really give us data superpowers. So here I have drawn a typical workflow that you will see in complex SQL queries that make use of common table expressions. Now what we're looking at here is a single SQL query. It's however a complex one because it uses CTEs. And the query is represented graphically here and in a simple code reference here. The blue rectangles represent the common table expressions, these virtual tables that you can define with the CTE syntax. Whereas the red square represents the base query, the query at the bottom of your code that ultimately will return the result. So a typical flow will look like this. You will have a first common table expression called T1 that is a query that references a real table, a table that actually exists in your dataset, such as fantasy characters. And of course, this query will do some work, right? It can apply filters, it can calculate new columns, and so on, everything that we've seen until now. And then the result of this query gets piped in to another common table expression. This one is T2 that gets the result of whatever happened at T1 and then applies some further logic to it, applies some more transformations. And then again, the result gets piped into another table where more transformations run, and this can happen for any number of steps until you get to the final query. And in the base query, we finally compute the end result that will then be returned to the user. So this is effectively a data pipeline that gets data from the source and then applies a series of complex transformations. And this is similar to the logical schema that we've been seeing about SQL, right? Except that this is one level further. Because in our usual schema, the steps are done by clauses, by these components of the SQL queries. But here, every step is actually a query in itself. So of course, this is a very powerful feature. And this data pipeline applies many queries sequentially until it produces the final result. And you can do a lot with this capability. And also, you should now be able to understand how this is implemented in code. So we have our usual CTE syntax with, and then the first table we call T1, and then here we have the logic within round brackets for T1. And you can see here that in the from, we are referencing a table in the dataset. And then for every successive common table expression, we just add a comma, a new alias and the logic, comma, new alias and the logic. And finally, when we're done, we write our base query. And you can see that the base query is selecting from T3, T3 is selecting from T2, T2 is selecting from T1, and T1 is selecting from the database. But you are not limited to this type of workflow. Here is another, maybe slightly more complex workflow that you will also see in the wild. And here you can see that at the top we have two common table expressions that reference the database. So you can see it here, like the first one is getting data from table 1 and then transforming it. The second one is getting data from table 2 and then transforming it. And next we have the third CTE that's actually combining data from these two tables over here. So we haven't yet seen how to combine data except through the union I wrote the join here, which we're going to see shortly, but all you need to know is that T3 is combining data from these two parent tables. And then finally, the base query is not only using the data from T3, but also going back to T1 and using that data as well. And you remember we said that great thing about CTEs is that tables are reusable. You define them once and then you can use them anywhere. Well, here's an example with T1, because T1 is defined here at the top of the code, and then it is referenced by T3, but it is also referenced by the base query. So this is another example of a workflow that you could have, and really the limit here is your imagination and the complexity of your needs. You can have complex workflows such as this one, which can implement very complex data requirements. So this is a short overview of the power of CTEs, and I hope you're excited to learn about them and to use them in your SQL challenges.